other public men are destined to be disliked. But the most important thing about a public man is not whether he's loved, whether he's respected. And I hope to restore respect to the presidency at all levels by my conduct. And as far as the charisma and all the PR tricks and everything else that's supposed to make you look like a matinee idol, forget it. If that's what they want in a president, I'm not the man.
But the name Nixon is anathema to millions of American voters. To them, Richard Nixon is a political opportunist to whom the desired political end is justified just about any political means. Well, how does Richard Nixon, if elected by a majority, go about reconciling the doubts of the skeptics?
I do have, based on a hard political career going back over 22 years, some people in this country who consider me as anathema, as you pointed out. But on the other hand, I believe that I have the kind of leadership qualities that can unite this country and that at least can win the respect, if not the affection, of those who have a very bad picture of Richard Nixon.
Let's go back in time a little to the late 1940s, the early 50s. Did you commit no political excesses on which you look back with regret?
Well, I'm not going to discuss the charges of my critics going back to the late 40s and the early 50s and the 60s for that matter. I have been able to take it, and I respect the right of people to disagree with the kind of campaigns that I have conducted. But I will insist on one point, and I will certainly submit my case to any questioner, including you, on this point. Throughout my political career, I have campaigned only on issues, never on personalities. I believe that every individual who runs for office must submit his entire political career, everything that he's said, everything that he's done, to public scrutiny. And his opponent has a right and a responsibility to attack those policies so that the people can see the choice. I have done that. I've attacked hard, and I have been attacked hard. And I have no apologies to make with regard to having presented the case as well as I could.
And no regrets?
I'm as you know, a pretty good self-critic. You have to be, or otherwise you'll never survive. And certainly I must have made a number of mistakes through the years. But you learn from mistakes. You attempt to become a better man through the years. I think, for example, I'm a much better candidate in 1968 than I was in 1960.
Why?
It isn't because there's a new Nixon. As you well know, my face hasn't changed much. I've lost a little hair and perhaps a little more jolly than I was, although my weight is about the same. But the point is that the times have changed. The situation has changed. The problems are new. The country is new. The world is new. And if I haven't learned over the past 8 years about these new problems, and if I don't have new solutions to those problems, then I'm not worthy to be a candidate.
You were vice president only 6 years after you first went to Washington as a congressman. You were only 39 years old at the time. Did too much happen to you too soon in your political career?
Well, I've often wondered about that. Whether a man who has had only 6 years of experience, of course mine was a pretty intensive experience. I was a national figure in my first term in Congress, and I was a national figure as a senator. I wouldn't have been selected for vice president had that not been the case. But nevertheless, I was only 39 years of age. And that's a pretty young age to assume the immense responsibilities of the vice presidency, let alone the possibility of becoming president at any time. It might have been better, looking back on my career, if my time had come a little later. But you can't select your time.
You say that you were a national figure early on in your political career, but you made your reputation as a communist fighter. Wasn't that the easy way to do it?
Certainly in this business of what you call communist hunting, there have been charges made that couldn't be substantiated. There have been excesses committed by committees and incidentally by the communists too. But as far as my participation in that case, I think if you read the whole record, it's one that stands up. I think I was fair, I think I was strong, and it resulted, of course, in the conviction of a man who had been engaged in activities involving espionage.
So no regrets on that score either?
On the Hiss Chambers case, none.
Well, you say on the Hiss Chambers case, none. What about your use of the word treason, traitor, in talking about the Democrats?
Mike, you can study my entire political career. You can study every speech that I have made. I have never used the word traitor in referring to Harry Truman, Dean Acheson, any of those who were in government during that period. The term 20 years of treason is one that I, in all of my campaigns during that period, repudiated. I pointed out that the question which was before the American people, was not one of the loyalty of Harry Truman or Helen Gahagan Douglas or others against whom I was running, but the question of judgment, their judgment as to what the communist conspiracy was up to. I think their judgment was very, very bad on that point. And incidentally, since we've mentioned Harry Truman, he was a courageous president and in some ways will be designated one of our great presidents at that time. But I think his judgment in the handling of the Hiss case was very bad. And I have no apologies for having nailed the administration for what it did and failed to do in that case.
Do you feel yourself misunderstood by a good number of Americans?
No. Let me understand one thing there. I have never resented the fact that commentators on television and columnists and the rest point up that I'm not a man who is loved by the people, that I don't have charisma and the rest, or that I'm not a pretty boy, and my face is not particularly one that's going to win any beauty prizes. That doesn't bother me a bit. I'm not concerned about the attitude of my critics on those scores. What I am concerned about is this. Do I have the solutions to the problems that confront America today? If I have those solutions, my critics, I think, will respect me for presenting them and putting them through. If I don't have the solutions, I don't care how good my style is.
You once said, if I had my druthers, I'd like to write 2 or 3 books a year and go to one of the fine schools, Oxford, for instance, and just teach and read and write. Why didn't you?
I suppose the political virus attacks an individual at some stage in his life, and once you catch it, there's no drug to get rid of it. In fact, the only illness that I have is hay fever. And I've tried every drug there is, incidentally, and nothing works. I still sneeze in September, and my eyes will water, as you see, in this time of year. And so it is with the virus of politics. There's no drug, there's no psychiatric treatment that you can take that's going to change it. As I look at the presidency, what appeals to me about it is not that I'm going to be somebody. As Eric Severide once said, what really separates the men from the boys in politics is that the men are people that want to do something with an office, and the boys want to be somebody. As far as I'm concerned, I've had everything, all the great the praise and everything that comes that from being in high office. That means nothing to me now. But I think I can do something about the problems of building peace abroad and peace at home that some other man might not be able to do.
Richard Nixon, dead at 81. The irony is that despite the disgrace of Watergate, he died with the affection of some and the respect of many for his courage, his intellect, and his determination to ask history to judge him with compassion.
Salute in memory of former President Richard Nixon. The ceremony took place in Washington, D.C. today, just before a final farewell at Nixon's birthplace here in California. Richard Nixon made it quite clear he did not want to be buried in our nation's capital. He was born in Yorba Linda, now home to the Nixon Presidential Library, and that's where he was laid to rest. Quite an emotional scene for family, friends, and every president and first lady to follow Nixon into the White House. Political foes and allies alike had a hard time keeping their emotions in today.
Richard Nixon. And may God bless the United States.
Senator Bob Dole is just one of those speaking at Nixon's funeral. Governor Pete Wilson and evangelist Billy Graham also shared fond memories.
First, with Stan Atkinson, Carol Bland, weather with Shelley Monahan, Eric McClendon on sports, home of Michael Kidd and Live Copter 3, and Northern California's #1 news team. This is Channel 3 Reports.
May God bless Richard Nixon. And may God bless the United States.
A bittersweet farewell to America's 37th president as Richard Nixon is laid to rest. Hello, I'm Dave Walker, sitting in for Stan Atkinson tonight, who will be joining us shortly with a live report from South Africa.
Good evening, I'm Carol Bland. Our top story at 11 o'clock, a final farewell to one of America's most controversial presidents. Channel 3's Greg Larson joining us now live from Yorba Linda with more. Greg?
Carol, Richard Nixon's reputation as an expert in foreign policy was not questioned. He also had some major successes in domestic policy. But there was something Richard Nixon wanted through the last years of his life, and perhaps he found that with his death. And that was a reconciliation with the American people. 1,800 of Mr. Nixon's friends, supporters, and one-time political opponents, and all 5 surviving presidents, turned out today to say just one more time to him, "Hail to the Chief." A man who lived nearly half a century on the world political stage, in the spotlight and in the shadows, but always with desires to achieve his dreams.
He was a boy who heard the train whistle in the night and dreamed of all the distant places that lay at the end of the track. How American.
It was his heart that taught us the great lesson of Richard Nixon's life, to never, ever give up.
And perhaps his final dream was to be once again openly accepted on the nation's political stage, after disgrace of having to resign the office he always dreamed of holding.
Richard Nixon would be so proud that President Clinton and all living former presidents of the United States are here, symbolizing that his long and sometimes bitter journey had concluded in reconciliation. And for those who came to bid their fond adieu, it was a time to heal for supporters and opponents alike.
I came to terms with him some years ago, and I'm glad to be here to pay my respects to him today.
His courage and his perseverance in battle certainly won him the love and loyalty of his friends, and the respect and admiration of many of his old critics.
Today is a day for his family, his friends, and his nation to remember President Nixon's life in totality. To them, let us say, may the day of judging President Nixon on anything less than his entire life and career come to a close. The inscription on Mr. Nixon's gravestone refers to the fact that the greatest title that any man could have hoped to attain is the title of peacemaker. Well, perhaps tonight in death he found peace himself. Peace in the fact that his reputation, his place in history, will be one of respect and admiration by his colleagues and the American people. Mr. Nixon was 81 years old.
He was controversial, but that is not what we heard about today, was it, Greg?
It indeed wasn't, Carol. It was talking about his history in a fine place he actually should hold in American history for the great things that he did do.
Thank you for your report. Dave?
And Northern Californians, like all Americans, remembered Richard Nixon today, and they did it in different ways, some in thought, others with memorabilia. Channel 3's David Gregory has the story.
Nothing that Nixon wrote here. I do have others that he did, and certainly...
Sacramento and Rick Stevenson can't imagine a world without Richard Nixon in it. But after Nixon's death, he does have a room full of memories. The campaign pins, a necktie, bumper stickers, even a reflector button. It took years to collect all of this. Stevenson has been a Nixon fan for years, telling Mike Boyd about first meeting Nixon when he was 8 years old. They met again, but Stevenson never did remind Nixon of that childhood thrill.
I had wanted to, and this was one of the big disappointments when I saw he was stricken last week and when he died.
At a TV studio today, Attorney General Dan Lungren remembered Richard Nixon. His father was one of the Nixon's personal doctors. He became emotional recalling his memories.
The other thing is the great love that the president had for Mrs. Nixon. And I'll remember that as a kid.
Nixon's last visit to Russia is the subject of an article in 7 Days, a Russian-language newspaper. While preparing to mail copies of their latest issue, an editor said the Russian people will always remember Richard Nixon.
He was our friend, and he changed political to best side between America and Russia.
There is a lot of discussion about how historians will remember Richard Nixon. Many we talked to in Sacramento conclude, despite his very public mistakes, he will be remembered as one of America's great presidents. at the Capitol. David Gregory, Channel 3 reports.
Nixon once said that the true measure of a political leader is not whether he is well liked, but whether or not he is respected. Carol?
A somber, tearful, and emotional burial as a nation remembers Richard Milhous Nixon. To you, well, forgiveness, remembrance, and honor of the nation's 37th president.
And the funeral of Richard Milhous Nixon begins our look at top stories this morning here on News 10. Eulogies from President Clinton and others focused on Mr. Nixon's long accomplishments. All 4 living former presidents and dignitaries from 80 nations attended his funeral in Yorba Linda yesterday.
Library in Yorba Linda. A 1-hour, 20-minute long ceremony under cloudy skies and broadcast around the world. As News 10's Alan Frios shows us, thousands came to praise Nixon as a leader with global vision.
He loved his country, and he considered service his honor. It was a privilege to have been allowed to help him.
He was the grocer's son who got ahead by working harder and longer than everyone else. How American.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Oh yes, he knew great controversy amid defeat as well as victory. He made mistakes, and they, like his accomplishments, are part of his life and record. But the enduring lesson of Richard Nixon is that he never gave up being part of the action and passion of his times.
Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted.
Mr. Nixon was buried beside his wife Pat, who died last year of lung cancer.
The president has been laid to rest. The former president was buried beside his wife Pat near the house where he was born 81 years ago in Yorba Linda, California. Richard Nixon, politician, statesman, president, finally at peace today, Thursday, April 28th, 1994.
From NBC News, this is Today.
700-pound black granite headstone marks the grave with an epitaph chosen by Mr. Nixon. It's a line from his first inaugural address. It says, "The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of Peacemaker." More on the funeral of the 37th president from ABC's Bill Redeker in Yorba Linda.
Near the home where he was born, Richard Nixon was given full military honors and the respect, even admiration, of 4 former presidents, his family, his colleagues.
In the conduct of foreign policy, Richard Nixon was one of the seminal presidents.
In a service underscored by patriotic music selected by the Nixon family and the 37th president himself, eulogies were mixed with tears.
The largest figure of our time, whose influence will be timeless. That was Richard Nixon. How American. May God bless Richard Nixon. And may God bless the United States.
President Clinton, who as a young man actively fought Nixon's Vietnam policies, said the time had come to judge his entire career.
May the day of judging President Nixon on anything less than his entire life and career come to a close.
Richard Nixon was buried next to his wife, Pat. The ceremony ended with a flyover salute from the Air Force, a final plane of taps, and a good deal of what he had always wanted, honor and respect. Bill Redeker, ABC News, Yorba Linda, California.